But first, Andrea Kersten, the chief administrator of Chicago's Civilian Office of Police Accountability, or COPA, is under scrutiny days after dismissing 2 alleged whistleblowers. 16 current or former employees, they've signed a letter calling for the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability to take a vote of no confidence against Kersten. They claim that she retaliated against employees who challenged her investigations and that she's used the organization to push an anti-police agenda. Now, to better understand the details and what it means for the city's ability to accurately and effectively investigate police misconduct, we are joined now by Joe Ferguson. He's the president of the Civic Federation. That's an independent, nonpartisan government research group. And he's also the former inspector general for the city of Chicago. Great to see you again, Joe.
Good to see you.
To understand these allegations that are surfacing against Andrea Kersten in these recent weeks, I want to get a better grasp of COPA first. So I gave a little bit of background, Joe, but how would you describe Chicago's Civilian Office of Police Accountability and just the role that it plays in police oversight?
It is primarily an investigative agency for the most serious forms of police misconduct, official action that involves misconduct. And we think about those things most typically, and their profile is highest in relation to use of force, violence, and particularly gun incidents. Mm-hmm. And so if there is a police-involved shooting is the terminology, the matter must be investigated by COPA. And there are other things, Fourth Amendment violations, so on and so forth. But that is their primary function, but they do a whole bunch more than that.
So they're conducting investigations into allegations of police misconduct. And so we're clear, what power do they have?
It's investigative power, and it stops at the waterfront, if you will. They do the investigation, they make findings, they make recommendations. The recommendations go to the police superintendent's office. Those are processed, a determination is made, and for action. And if it leads to charges, then we're talking about going into the judicial or administrative judiciary components of a very, very crowded system.
So Andrea Kersten, she's the chief administrator of the organization. And administrator can sound bureaucratic, if you will, but essentially the chief administrator, she's running the show, right?
She's the boss.
She's the boss.
And she is the first fully appointed person. The agency is the successor to the independent police, I can't remember what IPRA was. IPRA, that was deemed to be a failed agency under the Police Accountability Task Force charged by Rahm Emanuel after the revelation of the Laquan McDonald shooting video. Mm-hmm. This is the successor. It was set up by Sharon Fairley, who very shortly after the agency came into being left the office. Andrea Kersten is really the first full appointed head of that agency.
Right. So we've got this situation now where some current and former staff, they're alleging that Kersten has an anti-police bias. She recently fired 2 purported whistleblowers, and your successor, who's Chicago Inspector General Deborah Witzberg, she's doing a preliminary review to actually determine whether an investigation is warranted here. So what could that review process look like?
So it was handed off to her or referred to her by the Community Commission for Public Safety Accountability, who received allegations from multiple employees over a period of time. They voted to refer all of that as serious matters warranting potential investigation to the Inspector General's office. That initial review, it can be expansive, it can be narrow, but usually what happens, and in this type of situation from the public reporting, we understand it's both statements, documents, materials. There's an initial gathering of information that comes from city databases, the agency's databases, maybe some communications requests, to determine whether or not there is kind of sufficient amount of information independently corroborable, separate from those with a vested interest in all of the activities.
So this is like the fact-finding
there's a there
phase.
There. It's a preliminary fact-finding phase to determine whether to go full bore of an investigation.
So what would the IG need to find to be able to say, all right, we do need a full investigation here?
It's whether there is sufficient independent information to say that the smoke here is more than smoke and there's actually possibly fire. And it's a very soft notion. Think about it in terms of probable cause. In the criminal context, that doesn't mean more likely than not. It just means there is sufficient evidence to say there is a real potentiality of violation.
So we should be clear that you've got no additional information of what may or may not have gone on behind the scenes, beyond what our colleagues at the Sun-Times have reported and what we're sharing here today, Joe. But in your view, how concerning would you say these allegations are against Kersten?
They're extremely concerning. So first off, an investigative agency has to generally be regarded as beyond reproach, to be independent, to be neutral, to be fair. And when you have a situation where here you have multiple rounds of employees that now number 16 on the basis of great name drop for the Sun-Times on your part, just make sure the boss knows. That's a lot of people, and that suggests that this isn't one rogue or disgruntled employee. That there actually is something that fits more into kind of a pattern or broader environmental situation. So it's really serious. And when the CCPSA made that initial referral back in July,
that's the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability.
Great on you. It did so with respect to a multiplicity of materials and allegations that raised questions of both competency and, expressly stated in the referral letter, integrity. And then that really raises questions of legitimacy of the organization as it continues with work. And the work that it's doing is incredibly serious. Take, for example, sort of the continuing public controversy around the shooting of Dexter Reed back in the spring, which had a huge sort of scandal controversy kicked up around it on the basis of how the various officials, including Andrea Kersten, talked about it in the public domain before the matter was even investigated. So there's lots and lots of sort of background contextual questions, but when you have the agency with essentially higher and recommending fire authority, referring it to an independent investigative body for inquiry, investigation, formal investigation into competency and integrity, you have a serious crisis of legitimacy with respect to the reputation of an agency that everybody needs to trust.
If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. Now, 16 current and former employees of COPA, they want steps to be taken to oust Andrea Kersten. This is after she fired 2 purported whistleblowers who accused her of anti-police bias. And we're digging into that with Joe Ferguson, who's the president of the Civic Federation and as well the former Chicago Inspector General. So, Joe, I think a really important question here is, could a potential probe like this one get in the way of COPA's work, which is investigating misconduct? Or do you think that both can happen successfully at the same time?
That is the question of this moment. An investigation of misconduct, wrongful termination, retaliation, and any other things, that takes a long time. That can take a year or longer. And in the meantime, you have this cloud that hangs over the agency. Whether or not that cloud is of a dimension and of an impact that really raises the very question that you're asking, that's something that the Civilian Commission for Public Safety Accountability really is responsible for asking. And we've seen in the news that that the commission published a notice of hearing, closed session, that was conducted on Friday, which was signaled to include receiving essentially testimony from various of the people who are complainants in the matter. Of course, they have previously received documents, materials, statements, so on and so forth, at least as publicly reported, about prior instances. They aren't the ones to investigate whether or not there's been a wrongful termination or retaliation. They are the ones that have to determine whether all of this is sufficient in both how it sounds in its substantive terms and its impact on public perception and legitimacy, that we need a change of leadership.
So if the Inspector General does determine that an investigation makes sense here, Joe, how long could the entire process take?
Look, so far we know that there's 16 people who have now advanced allegations. That means it's a really complicated matter. I will be surprised if the 2 initial antagonists and complainants here, having been terminated a week ago, I would be surprised if we don't see a lawsuit for wrongful termination. That adds to the complexity. To your question, 18 months would be a very fast investigation, and that is why it's critically important for the commission to separately do the work of
Right.
making a determination of whether this is a scenario in which leadership has to change, even in a scenario in which the leader, Andrea Kersten, ultimately is found to be essentially exonerated and having had a basis for everything that she's done. We don't have the luxury of non-legitimacy, and that in and of itself is part of the backdrop that exists right now, with the head of the FOP fighting with Andrea Kersten fighting with the police superintendent. And it's too important to function to sort of sit in this purgatory.
Yeah. As we talk about the numbers, these 16 current or former employees that have written this letter here. So COPA's budgeted to have 157 employees. So this would be 16 employees out of that number, which is still significant.
Yes.
The Sun-Times asked COPA for comment late last week. This was ahead of that closed-door meeting that you mentioned that happened on Friday. The deputy chief administrator responded, quote, "We have not received any notification or communication of anything related to this matter and will not provide any further comment." So, Joe, what steps could COPA take here? I mean, would you expect to see the organization issue a statement or stay mum on this?
Stay mum until they know exactly what the commission is doing. And I think that makes it really important so we know there was a notice, we know there was a hearing, we know they were receiving statements or testimony from some of these employees on Friday. What they should be doing is determining whether or not there is a sufficient, in essence, a similar version to what the IG is doing right now. Is there a sufficient basis to believe that there's a there for which all of these claims of bias and so on and so forth, retaliation, is such that there needs to be a next stage of that hearing in which Andrea Kersten is offered the opportunity to come in and speak and tell her account of things with an understanding of exactly what's been put on the table, because there's no reason to think right now that she and her leadership, and I think you were mentioning Ephraim Eady, who was the first deputy. Ephraim Eady is a communications guy. He's not even from sort of the investigative law enforcement realm. So, you know, and this sort of thing involving so many employees in an agency that the size that you're talking about, it means it also involves other members of the senior staff and supervisory staff. And so I think in the first instance, the commission really needs to say, okay, we've had this hearing. There is a sufficient basis for us to continue with a process here around the question of whether or not there should be a vote of no confidence. That's going to take a few weeks.
Yeah, so a lot of employees involved here, and a lot of agencies too. So we got COPA, the CCPSA, the Inspector General, Chicago's City Council, right? Lots of folks who need to weigh in, Joe. The ultimate goal here is something we talked about earlier, right? Making sure that police accountability is happening properly in this city. Big picture, do we have the right system in place to make sure that that's happening?
We've created this system, as we often do in Chicago. There's too many cooks in this kitchen. I think we knew it. CCPSA itself is about 2 years old. It trailed the creation of the Public Safety IG within the Inspector General's office and the creation of COPA, which was back in 2017. And at the time that those two components came online, the city said, we know that this thing will need to be right-sized. We know that there will need to be a 2.0 version. We're 7 years in with more cooks in the kitchen, and adding to that list, it's the court monitor, who's supposed to actually be overseeing whether or not this system is both effective and has integrity. We may have a civil judge if a lawsuit is filed, and we have the media conducting an investigation in all of this. What all of that adds up to is static noise, people bumping into each other, and as to the component parts in that formal crowded kitchen, it's time for a right-sizing, a 2.0 version, because these entities actually have overlapping powers, overlapping responsibilities, not well-defined handoffs and relationships defined.
So that said, then what is the very next step here?
The very next step is really to focus on the issue at hand right now, and that is whether or not, from the IG's perspective, this thing actually warrants serious investigation, and for CCPSA to determine whether or not the public face of all of this, which is against a backdrop of a history where there's already a lot of concern and contention around legitimacy and bias, whether or not it's such that a change in leadership is needed more immediately, because we cannot wait the duration of a full-blown investigation for something that is so important to the city.
We've been speaking with Civic Federation President and former Chicago Inspector General Joe Ferguson about firings and complaints at COPA and what they could mean for police oversight here in this city. Thank you for breaking that down, Joe.
You bet.